This is Weyland Burton, continuing with a sequel to the original Burton military career. Grant and I had a little discussion, and he wanted just a tad more information that we didn't touch upon too clearly the first time around. So I'll give it a shot this time. I may refer to some notes here just so I don't leave room for another sequel in the future. The one thing that I did not mention that I wish I had of was my military ID number. Those things are very important, and so much so you seemingly never forget it. Mine was 1490-1658, or said another way, 14901-658, and you had to have that like we now have to have our Social Security numbers. Everything we did in the military had to be accompanied by your 1490-1658, sir, as a rule. And also my DD-214s at the end of the military service, you receive that if you have an honorable discharge, and that serves you very well in the job market and otherwise as you go through the rest of your life. As stated previously, my military service was essentially a positive experience, and I would not wish to in any way malign those who seek to go that route. I chose to limit mine to 4 years, or as it turned out 3 years and 10 months. But those who make careers of military service have my admiration and respect. The first thing that I thought about when I was thinking about a follow-up to what I'd said before was the transition that's involved for both your, in my case, my wife and myself. We knew there would be 6 weeks of basic training followed by an indefinite amount of time at tech school, and I did not know where my technical training would be until after graduation from the basic training course, and turns out mine was in electronics at Biloxi Air Force Base in Mississippi. My sweet lady met me there soon after my arrival, and I had forgotten that we lived in 2 locations while we were in Mississippi, but the one I remember was a little duplex house that we had enough room to even have company. We had a constant visitor. Ben Snowdy was his name. He was from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Eventually his wife came down and joined him, and we would spend quite a bit of time eating tomato sandwiches and other cheap cuisine that we could afford. And many people in my career field, which I discussed earlier, were prone to, it involved a lot of intense pressure. They told us that the Russians knew who we were, and we were not to talk to our spouses about anything in our training, and they just kept the pressure on you tremendously. Said when you were walking down the street, they could be on the building tops, and they could have devices that would pick up your voices, and so we were to have no communication with our spouses at all about our training. And I think that helped guys to have nightmares in their sleep, and they would wake up crying. And every flight is what it was called. Every group that was in training always lost some to mental problems. They would have to go to I think it was the 4th floor. It was always a joke. When someone came up missing, the idea was they'd be on the 4th floor at the hospital. And as stated, I did not have to continue through the completion of the course, but I had already completed the necessary elements involved. Back to the living conditions, after we finished, I didn't exactly graduate since I had my surgery and was put in another career field. I was sent to Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, which was headquarters of Strategic Air Command, 99th Bomb Wing. Carol and I drove up in a vehicle followed closely by a U-Haul trailer, which had everything that we were going to have in our apartment. And when we got there, I'll tell you this to show you how money conscious we had to be. We did not go the Mass Turnpike, which would be the easiest way to get there because it was a toll road, and we had to avoid that. So we went in on some kind of back roads, and I remember when we were in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which was the first city of any size, it really seemed like a different world. It was like going back in time. All of the architecture was really old, and all the cities were, to us, it seemed like they were run down. There was nothing modern, but that's the way the people wanted it who lived there. To move right along, when we got there and started looking for an apartment, it was a very uneasy time. We finally located housing that we could afford in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is a part of a Tri-Cities deal, and we ended up getting an apartment in a row house, which is where the buildings are just side by side, no space in between them at all, and we were on the third floor, as I remember, initially, and the good part was across the street from us, it was South Canal Street, that's the name of the street, and it was named South Canal Street for its proximity to the Connecticut River. And you couldn't see the river from our house, but every time we went somewhere we had to go out and hit a road that crossed the Connecticut River, and it was shallow and very fast flowing, actually quite pretty. But between us and it were some industries that were kind of eyesores. But the type people that lived in those row houses was not your best class of people, including, I guess, us military people. Anyway, that's all that we could afford. And just to incorporate another aspect of my out of the military part, we had an occasion when we were at a grocery store. We saw this vehicle with a South Carolina tag, and it was pulling a U-Haul, and the man and his wife, as it turned out, looked to be as bewildered as we were when we got there. So we figured since they were from Louisiana, we might be able to help. So we engaged them in conversation, and it turns out they were just as poor as we were, and they were fearful and couldn't find anything. So we invited them to spend a night or so with us until they could find a place to stay. We stayed fast friends until just a few years ago. It's been a while since we've seen them. Elton and Marilyn Smith was the names. And they were devout Nazarenes, and he had a master's degree, and she had college education, and yet he talked with the most profound Southern drawl, I think, of anyone that I have known. So they were always appreciative to us for the help that we provided them in that. And when I was sent TDY for 6 months to Guam, she moved back to Alabama, and her and Dwight, and I was gone for 6 months to Anderson Air Force Base on Guam, from which the B-52s took off to do the bombing in South Vietnam. The tough part of that was everybody worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and that gets to be quite a grind. And then when we came back from there, I think I mentioned before, there was a lot of resentment about the war, and people were not very kind, and so we had to experience that. But we moved back into the row house apartments and stayed there until discharge. And I wanted to cover as the next subject the recreation things that we had. At Westover, I did not work extreme hours. I worked basically like a 40-hour week. So we did have some time on our hands and no money in our hands, so our recreational pursuits were rather simple. I know one of the highlights for us was to go to the Ponderosa Pine. I forget how many flavors of ice cream they offered, but I shall never forget that my lady got hooked on, if I can think of the name, pistachio ice cream. And I don't care for it at all, but I knew what she was going to order. Every time we went to the Ponderosa Pine, which is where a lot of other military people went and had their social activities, which meant talking to friends. That was a big deal for us. Another thing we did for recreation was when we had the gas money, we would drive and see sites, natural sites for the most part, some historical sites in New England. And during this time we had some friends that we had known previously who were discharged before us that came back to visit us, and we loaded up in one vehicle and went to Niagara Falls. I almost said Nakalula Falls. Niagara Falls for a visit, which was a blast really for us. And there were some other so-called recreational things that might be surprising to you. One was church. That seems like an unlikely thing, but it's so refreshing to go to church. Most of the people who went to church where we did were from the South, and it was from that group that we had our closest friends, maintained relationships until now with some. I know Charles and Carol Fountain, we still see Carolyn a lot, and then a couple from Georgia, Steve and Eileen Ritchie, and there were some more that we knew from Texas and other places that we became fairly close with. I wanted to just mention one other thing that was of interest to me. I was on duty at the base gym, and this just proves that you never know what might happen. That seems a benign type of job where you wouldn't have any problems, but during the years that I was in the Air Force, there were racial problems that were not rampant, but they did crop up here and there around the states, and even within the military ranks there were sometimes problems, and it was my responsibility to close the gym, and I've tried to remember if it was 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. I don't remember which it was, but one of those times was the closing time, and we had a lot of people that played basketball that just dearly loved the game, and normally there was no problem. People knew it closed at 9 or 10, so they left. Well, this particular night there was a group of 8 or 10, and all of them happened to be black, and I had no consciousness of it being a black-white issue as I tried to get them to leave. And one of the smaller guys, if not the smallest guy in the group, was very mouthy, and he said some rough stuff to me in really coarse language, and I was not above having a little temper problem myself, and so I made it very clear to him that he and they would exit the gym immediately, and he made some specific threats to me pertaining to a knife and how it slices through the body on occasion. So I remember the biggest guy in the group was named Holmes, Holmes, and Holmes just kind of wrapped his arms around this little mouthy guy and said, "Look, man, he's just trying to close." He said, "Let's get out of here." They did. That in and of itself is not all that interesting, I suppose. However, less than a week later, would you know that he stabbed a man to death? And that made me look back upon the incident with a little different feel, and I thought, I am very thankful that did not turn into anything. I don't think that I have left anything out that I intended to cover. I hope this is of benefit to some. I didn't touch a whole lot upon like when I achieved different levels of rank. I did attend a few schools to improve my situation for gaining rank. However, in our career field, we did not gain rank very fast at all. There were just too many people and too few allotments for better rank. So I did not go beyond sergeant, and I was okay with that because I wasn't going to make it a career. But if I had chosen to make it a military career, I would have tried to have transferred to another part of the Air Force. I believe that will do it unless Grant has a specific thing.
Okay, so in boot camp, do you have any other stories from that?
Well, it's a matter of remembering them, actually. I know in our medical training, I mentioned the race situation, and the guy I worked with, and you have to give each other artificial respiration, and he was a black guy from Montgomery, Alabama, and just a great guy. And we just had such a good relationship, and I thought that was the irony of the day, that there was known to be a lot of racial trouble, yet here was a guy from my home state and myself that we felt almost inseparable in helping one another out. So that was a good thing, and I already mentioned how that people helped the young man that was not physically fit, and then I know the anticipation of getting into town. Yes, Grant just reminded me of an episode of losing my high school ring. In this case, I was on KP duty, and I told him I would comment about KP duty. I was washing pots and pans, and my ring dropped off and went down the drain, which I never saw it again, of course. And a part of KP duty that I got stuck with a lot was peeling potatoes. I had spent part of my life preparing potatoes for planting, and there's no point in my going into agriculture here, but you slice them in quarters or chunks. And so I was pretty good with a knife and peeling potatoes, but we peeled hundreds of pounds each time we were on KP. And I could peel about 2 or 3, while the other guys that hadn't spent a lot of time peeling potatoes in their lives were peeling one. And so they liked to see me on KP because we could get through those potatoes in a quick fashion. Another thing that might be funny, it wasn't funny to me at the time, was I was on KP duty, and I observed a big, he was a cook, and I think his rank was Master Sergeant. I'm not positive of that, but anyway, he was making rice pudding, and he was dipping his hands and arms in that to stir it. And like I said, it's not very appetizing. But the worst part was it was always hot there, and he was sweating rather profusely. So I lost my appetite for rice pudding, and do not to this day even want to think about rice pudding. Of course, I've never exposed to it anyway, but that was something that, and I described to Grant the mail call situation. We would anxiously await letters from home, and then the TI would call your name out and throw the letters to you. He knew everybody by name, so he'd throw the letters. Another question, Grant Scott?
Not really. I was trying to listen for 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I can stall around for 1 minute or not, Grant. It might be time to say, okay, this is it, and wind this thing up. I realize mine's not been a glamorous story, but it was a learning experience, very much so. Oh, the weather, that's what we did not discuss. In Massachusetts, I was in one of the worst northeasterners they ever had. Are we running out of time?
15 seconds.
Oh, okay. Well, that'll have to be a story that I tell to any individual who's interested enough to follow up on this. Thank you, Grant.
All right. Thank you.